And I want to start us off in Deuteronomy 30. And I want to give you a little bit of context to what's going on in Deuteronomy. If you have read the book of Deuteronomy, then you can attest to the book is teaching God's people, this new generation who was spared from the death sentence that was issued to their forefathers, the prior generation, because of their lack of faith, because of their unbelieving hearts. And God is now giving them, this new generation, his laws, the same laws and commandments that he gave the previous generation when he brought them up out of Egypt. And he's telling them that when he takes them and puts them in the land of promise, that they could either have blessings that comes from obedience or curses that comes from disobedience. And if you want to read that, all you need to do is go back to Deuteronomy 28. This is what this whole chapter is about. I put before you today the choice of life or death. To summarize it, is what God is doing here. And so then in Deuteronomy 29, he restates this, but he gives us something interesting that we need to hold on to as we consider the scriptures that we look at today. That is, these people that he's given the commandments to, he says, look, you participated and you've seen all these great signs and wonders, which really their forefathers, their predecessors really seen. But he says all the same, you've seen these wonders, these great signs. He says, you've walked in the wilderness in verse 5 for 40 years. Your clothes have not worn out. Your sandals has not worn out on your feet. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or strong drink, in order that you might know that I am the Lord your God. So he says, you've seen all these things, these miracles, these wonders. You've lacked not, you had no need while you was wandering this wilderness for 40 years. You had sandals that didn't wear out on your feet. And he says this, that they seen this and they experienced these things so that they may know him. But interesting enough, in verse 4 he says, yet to this day the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. I want you to hold on to this, because this is telling you the problem with God's people and why they find themselves in the same perpetual pattern of God giving them his commandments. They saying, oh yes, Lord, we're going to obey you. And then they disobey. And they find themselves enduring the wrath of God. They find themselves being scattered amongst the nations. And it's because God says right here that they have an inability, because of their faculties. God has not given them the faculties that they need to be able to know that he is truly the Lord. They've seen wonders, they've seen signs, but we're going to see that's not enough. All right, so now we go to Deuteronomy 30. And here's what we have is the restoration promise. The first thing we observed is that at this point, God is saying they're scattered among the nations. All the blessings and the curse which I have set before you, and you called them to mind. He says, so when it shall be, when you, all of these things have come upon you, the blessings and the curses which I've set before you, meaning he's reminding them of all the things, the commandments he's given them and the blessings and the curses. And he says, when they come to mind, when they are scattered among the nations, he says, he says, when it comes to mind and all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you. So this, the context, the setting is that they are banished, that they have been outcast, the curse has been brought upon them. And he says, this is what's going to happen when they're banished and scattered amongst the nations. He says, and you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons. So right here we see that he says once they're scattered among the nations, they're going to return to him. They're going to obey him. They're going to keep his commandments. They're going to truly obey God with their heart and soul and do all that he set before them within this book. He says, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So the first thing we want to observe is there appears to be a condition upon the restoration. The restoration is given right here in verse 3. Restore you from captivity. But you see this then right here. And it's not really a conjunction of that's conveying to you a conditional clause that's coming out. Because if they wanted a conditional clause, they would use the Hebrew word if, and that's not what they use right here if you check the language. But all in all, we see that if we see this as a order of events that usually then kind of signifies, you would see that there's obedience, there's a turning to God, there's obeying him, and then there's a restoration, right? Then he goes on, he tells you more details about what he's going to do in verse 4. If your outcasts are at the end of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. So you can see there's like an unpacking that God does the more and more you read these verses. Like he restates what he's going to do, and he's giving you more information about that process. Verse 5, the Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. So we see him refer back to this land promise, the land promise that was made to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Israel. And so we see the land promise, and then there's verse 6. We see this moreover right here. Now, here there's really, in the Hebrew, there's really no conjunction there. There's just the Lord your God. Jehovah Elohim will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants. The reason why the NASB inserts a moreover right here, because it's understanding from the context and for how the verses read, that God is unpacking more. He's recapitulating the story or the information he's giving them about what he's going to do in verses 6 through 10. So 1 through 5 is not a time subsequent order of events that's preceding 6 through 10. 6 through 10 is a restating of 1 through 5, giving you more information of what God is doing to cause 1 through 5, or better yet, 2 through 5, right? Because this is, in verse 2, is when we see the obedience, the turning, them returning to the Lord, your God, to obey. And so what do we see in verse 6? Verse 6 tells us how verse 2 happens, basically. So verse 6 is the cause of verse 2. And we hear, moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart. You see the parallel? You see the parallel in the reading, right? Up here it says, you return to the Lord your God. He's just telling them what they're going to do from their perspective. And you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul. Here it says what God is going to do to cause this, right, which is the circumcision, and the effect of that circumcision is this on them. It's going to cause them to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, so that you may live. And that you may live is the key, is the focus, because we have to understand this is a promise that us Christians see that's fulfilled truly within the church. Truly within the church. And so the point of this promise of salvation is that you may live. And this is key when you're asking the question, can you lose your salvation? Because God is operating here so that his people may live. Verse 7, the Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecute you, and you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments, which I command you today. So again, verse 8, still unpacking what's going to happen in verse 2. Verse 9 then tells us, then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly in all your work, all the work of your hand, in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and in the produce of your ground. And see, the reason why we know, without having to get into the Hebrew readings of the words and the different conjunctions that's used to follow this, even though that is great and is a beautiful thing. I can use Bible Hub and show you that in another video, but I'm not going to do it here, because you can get the same understanding by just reading what's going on in the text. If you read verse 9 and you read verse 5, God is saying that the outcome of the restoration, or part of the restoration, shall I say, is them possessing the land that he had promised to their fathers and prospering them. And he says, multiply you more than your fathers. In verse 9, he just unpacks that even more. He gives you more details on what does that look like, right? And so that's why I say verse 6 through 10, or 6 through 10 is just a recapitulation of what God stated in 2 through 5. And that's important how you read this, because you can read this and you can try to make this these events time subsequential, right? As if, okay, this happens, so God, they turn in obedience. God restores them. He returns them to the land that he promised to their fathers to possess it, right? He prospers them, and then God circumcised their heart to love the Lord your God, right? And then he places these curses upon their enemies, and then he calls them to prosper in the land. But it just doesn't read well. This doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense reading it like that. And so what you have to do is you have to understand that God is restating. This is kind of like his thesis statement in 1 through 5. And then this is his body, which he unpacks the things he spelled out in the thesis. And so we finally get in verse 10. If you obey the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of law if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So basically, this reads as if here, and the NASB has made this a conditional, is trying to read this as a conditional, but truly it's not. This conjunction in the Hebrew just reads when you obey the Lord your God. Right? As if verse 9 would happen when this happens. Kind of the same order up here. God says you will obey, and then the time subsequent event is that he restores and prospers. So there's obedience, there's a turning to the Lord with all your heart and mind, then there's a restoration, and that restoration includes God gathering them from the nations, bringing them back to himself, the land he promised, and prospering into the land. And so that's what we need to get out of Deuteronomy 30.